Welcome everyone to the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University and to our very first forum of the fall 2011 season. I'm Jennifer Bernardi, the Executive Director of the Ford Hall Forum, where the speaker and the audience get to exercise their freedom of speech. Thank you for joining us tonight at The Real Paper, Journalism Then and Now. The forum is very excited to host this Real Paper reunion, and we encourage you to look around the audience at the familiar faces that you haven't seen in a while. Tonight we'll be discussing what was inspiring and enlightening about this free counterculture paper and why it eventually folded. We'll also talk about what direction our experts think journalism as a means of communication and as a business is heading in the 21st century. Let's get started, but first I would like to thank the Ford Hall Forum's generous sponsors, including, among others, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Barr Foundation, the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, and our partners at Suffolk University, which serves as the forum's home base. We especially thank our season sponsor, the Boston Beer Company, makers of Samuel Adams Beer. Finally, the Ford Hall Forum very much thanks our members whose generosity makes this free public event possible. You too can become a member. Just go over to that info table right after the program. I am very pleased to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Monica Collins, who is a vice president on the board of the Ford Hall Forum. The Real Paper, where she worked from 1975 to 1979, set Monica Collins off on a career that took her to the Boston Herald, to USA Today, and back to the Boston Herald, with side trips at TV Guide, the Boston Globe, and various other publications. Today, Collins writes a syndicated column and works as a communications consultant to nonprofits. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Monica Collins.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for assembling this panel. All I had to do was give you a suggestion, you were off. So, it's happening. Oh my goodness, I am blinded by the light of this panel. I really am. I am very flattered and thrilled. I mean, when I was at the Real Paper, I was, kind of I wouldn't say I was the lowliest of the low, but I was on a low rung there at the Real Paper. And I was just starting out. Okay. But I am very flattered and thrilled to be in the company of such greatness and speaking to all of you about the Real Paper. First, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then how we will proceed is I will ask a question of each panelist, and they will answer. We know that. And then we will probably have more of a free-for-all discussion as the evening progresses, but in the beginning we're going to try to keep it a little organized. Anyway, Harper Barnes. Harper Barnes, when I came to the Real Paper, had already left the Real Paper, but he was a legend at the Real Paper. He is a longtime editor and cultural critic for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He has written for Rolling Stone and the Washington Post. He is the author of the novel Blue Monday and Standing on a Volcano, The Life and Times of David Rowland Francis, a biography of Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to Russia. Harper's on my left. Jan Freeman on my right. Since 1997, Jan Freeman has been writing for the Boston Sunday Globe's weekly language column, The Word. She worked as an editor at the Real Paper, Boston and Inc. magazines, and the Boston Globe, where she was a science news editor until she launched her weekly column on English usage. She is the co-author of Ambrose Bierce's Write It Right, the celebrated cynic's language peeves, deciphered, appraised, and annotated for 21st century readers.
That's how she felt when she finished it.
Laura Shapiro. Laura Shapiro, when she would come into the Real Paper, she would sit near me, and she had an aura of respect. You had a, really, Laura? You currently are a columnist for Gourmet.com, Gourmet Magazine's website. Formerly, you worked for the Real Paper, and for 16 years as a writer for Newsweek. Laura covered food, women's issues, and arts, and won several journalism awards for her work. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Gourmet, Granta, The American Scholar, Gastronomica, Slate, and many other publications. Her first book was Perfection Salad, Women and Cooking at the Turn of the Century. She is also the author of Something from the Oven, Reinventing Dinner for 1950s America, and Julia Child. Paul Solman, two away from me on the right of Jan Freeman. Paul Solman, since 1985, has been a business and economics correspondent for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer on PBS, a business reporter for GBH in Boston since 1977. Solman was the co-originator and executive editor of PBS's business documentary series Enterprise. Solman was also the founding editor of The Real Paper, as well as the East Coast editor of Mother Jones magazine. He began his career in business journalism as a Nieman Fellow at the Harvard Business School in 1976. His reporting has won him several Emmys and 2 Peabody Awards. Mark Zanger, Behind the Mask. Since 2007, Mark Zanger has worked as the Director of Communications for the Coalition of Families and Advocates for the Retarded. As a seasoned journalist, Zanger has worked as a freelance writer and restaurant critic for the Boston Phoenix since 1981. Zanger has published 5 books, mostly of which are related to his work as a restaurant critic. He has previously served as chief editor of DelphiForums.com, op-ed editor of Metro West News, and public information officer for Oxfam America, Inc. Before he served as editor-in-chief of The Real Paper from 1975 through 1980, Zanger went to Yale. This is the part I added. With cartoonist Gary Trudeau, he is the model for Zonker in Doonesbury. Sorry.
Mark. He's the model for Mark.
He's the model for Mark, exactly.
And that's not the only thing you got wrong.
Okay. Well, you'll correct me. First of all, before we begin, I would like to dedicate this forum to the memory of Kathy McCarthy, Arthur Freeman, and all Real Paper alums who have passed on. As a generation, we believed only the good died young. Freeman is remembered for his stiletto-sharp writing, his keen Shakespearean knowledge, and his rubber stamp. Thanks, but save it for your shrink. Yes, I guess a lot of this stuff we will have to save for our shrinks. Thus, tonight we'll offer an overview of the neurotic brilliance of it all. Basically, The Real Paper was an incredible incubator of talent. Here's just a smattering of the alums and a smidge of their achievements. And really, it's just a smidge of the achievements. Betsy Meyer went on to be a producer at Channel 2. Susan Sloan went on to be a producer at Channel 5. Ron Campisi's distinctive design saved many a publication. Really, it's only a smidge. And I have more here. Excuse me while I James Isaacs wrote about clubs and records. He's a music historian whose NPR commentaries and liner notes on great jazz records shine brightly. Ed Zuckerman wrote for the paper. He became a TV writer and producer for Law & Order, with various series and TV movies to his credit. Joe Klein wrote about politics. He went on to Newsweek and the famed anonymous author of Primary Colors. He's a persistent Sunday morning pundit. Joe Conason, political writer for Salon, is now political writer for Salon and the New York Observer. Rory O'Connor, writer, editor, is an investigative reporter, global TV producer, and blogger of Media is a Plural at roryo'connor.org. David Anson replaced Stuart Byron, the first film critic at The Real Paper. Anson went on to become the longtime movie critic of Newsweek. David Thompson, Jerry Perry, Pat McGilligan, David Rosenbaum followed Anson. In turn, they went on to write books and movies. Rosenbaum, in fact, became the editor of the paper. Photographer Peter Southwick became photo editor AP and the Globe. Lucy Bartholomew, editorial artist, became the longtime designer of the Globe. Lynn Staley, longtime designer at Newsweek. Janie Scott, freelance political writer, is the New York Times reporter, credited with coming up with the idea of Portraits of Grief, a Pulitzer Prize-winning series after 9/11. She recently wrote a book, Singular Woman, about Barack Obama's mother. When I helped Mark Zanger edit a weekly section called The Real Almanac, I hired Judith Barrett, who's now a renowned author and cookbook writer. I took on Stephen Reichlin, who is a grilling guru now, with specials airing all the time on public TV. Helen Reese, former promotions manager, is on the Ford Hall Forum board and a prominent literary agent. Bob Rotner, the publisher of The Real Paper, went on to work at Harvard and is now an education executive. Linda and Bob Williams, ace salespeople, eventually married, and I heard they went into the real estate business. Ah, the couples. One of the most famous pairs shares the stage with me, Paul Solman and Jane Freeman. And there were others, Lynn and Marty, Rory and Muffin, and many others. Those were the days, my friend. Office romances were not frowned upon. The crushes and the hookups were as intense as the times. David Rockefeller, an investor and part of the group that bought The Real Paper, called in yesterday from California to wish us well and tell Jen Bernardi at the Fort Hall Forum office that his experience at the paper was a shining highlight of his professional life. And this is from a Rockefeller. Imagine what it was like for the rest of us. I guess that explains why we're all here tonight. During a time in history when you didn't need a weatherman to tell which way the wind was blowing, we were part of a weekly paper with our fingers in the wind. The Real Paper represents so much more than just another job. Harper Barnes, you were present at the creation. You were the editor of the old Cambridge Phoenix and notoriously got fired, an event that gave birth to the Real Paper. Give us a brief history of the birth of the Real Paper from your perspective.
Well, I had lunch with Paul Solman today, and I asked him to tell me what had happened. Because I'm a little vague on some of it. See how well you do, for the usual reasons, considering the era. I was the editor of what was actually called the Phoenix. There were at the time two papers, the Phoenix and Boston After Dark, from 70 to 72. And I was just enough of a hippie that the articles in the paper, some of the articles in the paper had a certain antic quality. And the man who owned the paper, who understandably decided it was his paper, not my paper, and I think he wanted the paper to be more serious and to be more, I was told to be more like the New Republic. And he fired me, which was, I now realize, is right. But at the time, it seemed like an outrage. So, a group of us, including Laura and Paul and Jan, got together and went on strike. The thing I think I'm proudest of is that Howard Garsh, who is in the audience here, who seems to have gotten gray like me, Howard Garsh, who was the comptroller, went on strike with us, and you don't see that a lot.
And Russell Pergament, who was here, who was the circulation director.
And Russell Pergament, the circulation director. And so they went on strike. I got rehired. I got fired again. The Boston Globe used to keep this picture of me, and they'd run it on like page 3 every so often. They'd have the headline "Fired Again." They used to flop it, you know. So I was looking, so it appeared that they had taken 2 pictures. One picture flopped. And finally, I got the message, and I agreed to step down. And Paul reminds me that Carol Iran, who is not with us, who is with us, but not present, became the editor, and I went on I drove across the country. And anyway, after a while, Richard realized that it was almost as if I was still there. So he sold the paper to Stephen Bendis, who at that point changed the name of Boston After Dark to the Boston Phoenix, at which point, led by Paul, we started the real paper. That's the origin of the real paper.
And the name, The Real Paper?
Well, initially, we wanted to call it the Real Phoenix, I believe.
Yes.
And legal authorities, as I recall, we were advised that
Right.
that was unwise.
But so then a guy named Chuck Fager, who wrote for the paper, at a press conference where we were announcing that we were continuing on, despite the fact that the paper had been sold out from under us, they asked us what the name of the paper was, and nobody knew. And Chuck said, The Real Paper. That was it.
Paul Solman, you became the first editor of The Real Paper.
Right.
Founding editor of The Real Paper. You also worked with the inestimable Tom Freeman, who put the
I
first...
think he's estimable.
Oh, I think he's inestimable at that time.
Well, we give him a very high estimate.
Very high. I do remember this day, the first headline on the first story I ever wrote for The Real Paper. It was not a big thing. It was about Amish clothing for sale in Cambridge. And the thing about Amish clothing is it didn't have buttons. And I turned in the story, Tom edited it, and the headline he put on it was, Amish is as good as a mile. The first headline on my first story. Paul Solman, you became the first editor of The Real Paper. You worked with Tom Freeman, who's a wonderful managing editor. Speak about the freedom of writing and editing in that early paper. Were there any restrictions?
There was only one, which the two people on the panel actually affected. Now, but I'm going to have to, because Jan and I were trying to remember the details of this particular event, but Laura, I'm sure you can remember them. It was.
No, I asked you.
I know, but I don't remember the details. So.
Well, you were the editor. Tell me.
They told me it was a story by George Fraser. It was a Boston columnist, some of you may remember, who wrote Literary Life was the name of his column, wrote it I think twice a week, and it was, he kept using the word duenda, if anybody remembers or knows what that means. To this day I don't think I do. But he was a very au courant kind of, you're gonna give me a hard time, I haven't even finished the sentence yet. He fashioned himself, fancied himself au courant, and very stylish. That was his thing. And so I got him to write an article for the paper. I think it was about Bette Midler. Is that incorrect? Do you remember? Do you know what I'm talking about, even?
This whole thing is a blur.
At any rate, he used the word in the copy. He used the word that is spelled C-U-N-T. It just all by the by. I mean, it wasn't, a particularly peak moment in this article. It just, and that was fine. So we were in the basement, which was our home for the first couple of years, in Central Square in Cambridge. And the two of them came to me and said, you can't publish this. We can't publish this. So, well, what do you mean? George Fraser, this was a coup to get, the famous George Fraser to write for this, weekly newspaper. He said, well, you just can't, it's sexist, it's, you just can't do it. I said, no, how am I going to say, what am I going to tell George Fraser? They said, well, we don't care what you're going to tell George Fraser, you're not publishing it. Now remember, or maybe we should introduce at this point the fact that this was a cooperatively owned paper. If you were a full-time employee, regardless of what you did at the paper, you had a full share. And if you were half-time, part-time, like the cartoonist, some of you may remember David Omar White, he had a half share. And that you could vote that much if there were a meeting of the shareholders. You could decide, and the votes would be taken on the basis of that. So it wasn't as if I had enormous power in the organization. I couldn't just do what I want. I certainly couldn't tell two people whom I had enormous respect for, on top of everything else, and who are ferocious people, by the way. Just, you wouldn't want to tangle with them either. And so I said, well, we didn't publish the word, did we?
No, absolutely not.
There you go. QED. So that's the only thing. We published almost anything else. The only things I can think of, they're all off color, but was, I remember this, I don't know how to actually tell this story, because this also, the only other thing that I think that ever didn't get in was when Stuart Byron and I wrote that got in? That's shocking.
Let us
tell
in
them
on
what
it.
that one was.
Let us in on it, Paul. What was it?
No, I'm not going to say all of these things myself.
You have to. You have to say this one.
Did we really?
We had a little, not even a column, it was a little box on the back page or somewhere at the end of the paper that was called the Special of the Week. It could be anything. It could be a restaurant. It could be a little sort of park that you had discovered that was a nice place to be contemplative. Stuart Byron wanted to have the Special of the Week be an activity that he called fist fucking.
No.
And there was a lot of talk.
He was gay.
He was gay. And
we were unbelievably open-minded. And apparently some of us still are.
Did he get it in there?
Well, that she says yes, Jan says no.
No.
Jan remembers, so what did we,
As I recall, the reason he thought he could insist on this was that one week in desperation, there were no new little restaurants around. And nothing we could think of.
You can see the relationship between the two.
We actually did make the Special of the Week sex and illustrated it with a discreet but unmistakably heterosexual, heteronormative, we would say now, picture with just charming little piece of copy by John Lipsky, another wonderful colleague whom we've lost recently. And he just wrote an adorable little piece about how sex was good for communication between the generations. It didn't hurt the environment. There were so many things to recommend it as
Special of the
Week. And I think that's...
What would have happened if you had printed that CD?
Well, there's some discussion, some argument as to whether we did or not. I don't know. I don't think anything would have happened.
No.
It's not like George Collins, 7 words that you can't speak, and you've gotten fined.
This was a real paper. We didn't, I mean,
No.
you don't buy it, you don't want to buy it. This is not broadcast. That's all FCC. No, this is, like Hustler. I mean, there's way more prurient stuff out there than us. 74, maybe?
It was 74. It was before I got there.
It was, Stewart.
I would have remembered it.
73.
Also, well, let's be a little distinguished right now. Laura Shapiro. Of the many distinctive pieces you wrote for the Real, there was a woman's column with a determined but not strident voice. You were not in the tradition of Jill Johnston, the radical lesbian feminist who wrote for the Village Voice. Your column was more forgiving of men, for instance. Speak about your audience at that time. And could a woman's column exist in these postmodern times? But speak about your column and relate it to today.
Oh, well, that's a good question, actually, if we could, if you could get away with something like that, because we don't have forums like the Real Paper anymore. But at that time, we had a early on, there was a black writer at the paper who wrote a column called The Black Notes. And as the women's movement started to pick up, I thought, black notes, we should have women's notes. So I harangued Harper for quite a while, and he finally gave in and let me do this column. And it was great. It was the most fun you can imagine having. It was the dawn of the women's movement around here. There were a lot of stirrings of it, obviously, in the 60s, but here things were just picking up in 1970 in the great the Women's March that we had on August 26th. Everything kind of coalesced then, and there was lots going on. And I just went around writing about it, and because of the nature of the real paper, you just did what you want and said what you want. This was one of the big shocks when I got to Newsweek, and I realized things were different. They kept saying, you have to put in the other side. It never occurred to me. Or even if there was another side, that was right, I would be saying it. That never came up at the real papers. So we just did it, and I got great mail. There were not that many voices out there that were really speaking to these issues that were coming up: abortion and birth control and men. And believe me, men were a big problem. And I had no intention of being forgiving.
I thought you were, Laura. I thought you were. I thought you were. I remember when you referred to a boyfriend who then became a husband, and I was like, yay,
Yeah, you were forgiving to that extent. That's what she means by forgiving.
Forgave him. But the letters were great, and the fact that you'd go to something and people sort of looked to the real paper to keep this stuff out there. It was a time when women were doing a lot of things, and the straight press there was just no way they could write about it without putting it down, getting it wrong, condescending. It was the thing that the press has been trying to do about women's rights since about the middle of the 19th century, and that is A, report it wrong, and B, say it was over. According to the press, the women's movement ended in about 1872. So people looked to the real paper to see that this stuff was acknowledged and it was out there. And a lot of people hated what I was saying. Of course, the women's movement was splintered in many different ways, so if I landed on one side of a splinter, then I heard from the other people. But it was fine. It was fine. I had a great time doing it, and the hate mail, even the hate mail was good. We did tons about abortion. Abortion was a cause that I felt very, very strongly about, and I wrote about it endlessly, constantly. One great thing about the real paper was that you could beat a dead horse as long as you wanted. Just keep at it. It was fine. So I kept at abortion, and I would get letters. Boston, of course, is full of many people who, then and now, who are deeply opposed to abortion, and they would write to me and tell me I should have been aborted. And I kept all those letters and stuff. So it was great, and you could never do it today in a paper that had a kind of general reach. You can do it everything is segmented.
You could be a blogger.
Yes, you could be a blogger, and so other
You could
people
do it on
would-
Facebook with your friends.
Yeah, that just the people who agree with you would see it, but to write, we were a very general interest publication. And so when I think of the vast numbers of old people and Republicans who were reading it. Anyway, so it was a time, it was over, but it was great.
Thank you. Jan Freeman, you were the style queen at the real paper, which you have already told us that you kept something. You maintained standards. How did you create the style for the paper's prose and stick to it? You had a stable of gonzo writers. Everybody was flexing their muscles to write. How then did you copy edit that? How then did you create a standard for a paper that was on the edge?
I don't actually think much of that was my problem at all. I would say that I don't want this to sound like kids today, they can't write anymore, but the people we had writing for us regularly were, most of them, truly excellent. The regular stable, the rock writers, the music writers, Laura, lots of clean copy everywhere. I mean, those people were committed to clean copy. Now, there were also huge political pieces that needed to be cut and pasted and redone, and would end up with some messy stuff in them. But it's not as if there was any discussion of, you know, our house style being like the Times of the Globe. Nobody cared. All we had to do was be more or less consistent. I mean, we were busy writing wonderfully long headlines because we had room to, and, you know, putting shark's teeth in Richard Nixon's face. And the prose was just not a problem. It was a stellar group, and in fact, I was green enough at the time not to appreciate how lucky I was. This was only when I started editing different prose at different larger places that I realized that the median was really not quite as high as I had been led to believe. So thanks everyone in the real paper for making it easy.
This was true, by the way, of people who weren't even writers for the real paper who wrote either at the time or subsequently. Russell Perkins was here. I remember one day walking by a typewriter, obviously that was the era, and there was this little funny squib that somebody had written. I had no idea who had written it. And I read this thing and said, who wrote this? This is fabulous. And it turned out to be Russell. What was it about, Russell?
It was about what happened to the Campbell soup girls through their sexual escapades at military installations.
I don't think everybody heard that. Perhaps it's just as well.
You gave anybody a chance.
What?
I just
It
want
was
to
the
say,
Campbell soup kids, that's right.
this Campbell, Brenda bend over and Gene the Machine, if I recall.
Yes, it was this.
Hey, seeing us on the panel, I just
No,
want
you're not, Russell. You can't.
You
You're not
gave
being called
everybody
on.
a chance. I mean, anybody that had any talent in any possible realm was given an opportunity to express that, and that dynamism really propelled the paper forward. There were no internal class distinctions at the beginning.
Well, and for a while. And David Chandler, who's here also, I just wanted to say.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
He was a layout editor.
He was a layout editor, a design director, and went on to a career at the Boston Globe, wrote the book Life on Mars, wrote a piece for the Atlantic Monthly. I mean, and the copy, I can attest to what Jan says, the copy was just pristine.
Even if he does type with two fingers.
One.
Sorry, one.
But I mean, Laura, Mark, Harper, just absolutely perfect copy. I mean, just perfect.
Mark Zanger. Where do I begin? Well, you're going to criticize me no matter where I begin. So I'll begin with the Red Chef. The foodie column you wrote before there were foodie columns. Or do I start with the restaurant critic character you created? Please notice I do not speak his name, who endures to this day. You created the enlightened, politicized restaurant review way before Anthony Bourdain came on the scene. Also, your investigative reporting about the arsonist of Symphony Road exposed corruption at the city's core. Speak about your bifurcation. Well suited to speak about it, from style to substance that the real paper allowed you.
Okay. But first of all, we have to kind of go back and capture the atmosphere of that time a little bit. So let me begin by saying that while all those foundations that gave the Fort Hall Forum all this money to have us do this, they really should give that money to poor people. No, you see, there's no response to that, but in 1971, 2, 3, 4, 5, that would have been a laugh line. That would have been big. They should make us pay to do this. There you go. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, there's a much more wonderful story about the name that was often told by the late Arthur Freeman, since he was the hero of it. Arthur's story is that there was a vote of the collective. I was not present. I worked for the bad guys at that time. Boston After Dark renamed the Boston Phoenix. We were so ashamed we took out an ad in the real paper to express our solidarity. So Arthur's story is that the collective took a vote, and there were two nominees, the real paper and the real thing. And the real thing actually won, but since Arthur was counting the votes, he rigged it for the real paper because he knew that was better. Now, you know, 9 years later, I'm explaining to people why it has that name. I finally got bored and just started saying it's real paper, it's not plastic or metal. Come on, leave it alone. So, corrections, Monica. One, I no longer work for the Coalition of Families and Advocates, which dropped the R word on a rare case of their taking my valuable PR advice.
It was given to me, Mark, so.
Yeah, well, we gave you crap like that. Me problem. So, you know, now I actually work in mobile crisis intervention and mental health. I'm a paraprofessional social worker. Most of what I write is medically protected from any of you ever reading it. And, you know, maybe 10 people read it. So the freedom that we had, since we had failed to capture the atmosphere, was A, the freedom of desperation. It didn't matter. As long as we filled it up, people would buy it. And the freedom of the times, which involved, among other things, blurring all the lines between audience and performers. And it certainly this evening, you know, there are many people in the audience who know more than I do, and I anticipated that difficulty. I'm wearing this stupid outfit because I'm Robert Nato's body double at restaurants. And, well, you know, I use other names to make reservations. My picture really should not appear on the internet since it would make my job more difficult, and it's the last writing job I've got, and I hate to lose it. Yeah, I had a lot of freedom as a writer, although, you know, there would be strange constraints. When I got there, when I started writing for the real paper, I was not an owner, and I was working for a collective organization. And this was, you know, much better than being a Palestinian guest worker on an Israeli kibbutz, but structurally similar. In that, you know, the owners and managers ran the paper, and many of the columnists were not owners by then. This was kind of midway in the run. And so we actually had to organize the Real Paper Columnists Guild and negotiate for some trivial thing. I mean, we were paid in the mid 2 figures. Anyway.
Well, the highest pay at the paper was $175, and that was a week.
You better not tell me who that was. That could be trouble.
me and Rotner,
oh.
and 110 was the lowest full-time pay.
I started at 100 as a freelancer.
But that's after the cooperative.
Right.
Yeah, well,
No, it was before the sale, right before the sale.
Oh.
I think I went out and got food poisoning for about $50, maybe 60.
Yeah, no, 50 is what counts. $50 for a column.
That's right.
Did they reimburse you for your restaurant?
Yes.
Okay. And you could go wherever you wanted?
Yeah. No one.
And spend as much as you wanted?
No. That's the controller who just said that.
I don't remember. I think I could actually, because my taste ran to, this was, you know, what I had that was different. My taste ran to little ethnic holes in the wall anyway. So I kind of didn't review the big expensive places.
Bob the Chefs.
And I still don't like them.
Bob the Chefs. I remember you did Bob the Chefs.
Bob the Chef. I did every little Chinese restaurant in 20 miles around. And it was wonderful Szechuan food in those days. And you could do things, but you know, things would happen to you. Like when I started writing short takes, when I actually went on staff after the paper had been sold, the first or second or third week, Marty Linsky, the editor, decided that Laura Shapiro should, you know, kind of be my editor, and so Laura, you know, right on deadline, decided to teach me how to write. Which, you know, they were worse people, but it was not a great time, and I was an arrogant young person, and this arrangement did not last.
I interrupt briefly to say the only person who didn't come with us, who didn't stay with us at the real paper, but moved to the other paper, that is to say Boston After Dark, was George Kimball, the late George Kimball, a sports writer here for many years. And he explained to me, when he explained apologetically that he was leaving the collective to go to the other side, he explained that the reason he couldn't stay with the paper was that Laura Shapiro was going to edit him. And he simply couldn't stand it.
Mark, I want to get to the investigation you did of Symphony Road, which really put the real paper on the map when you say, in terms of, just a force to be reckoned with in the city. It was serious, it was big, that investigation. And tell me, did you feel any pressure at the time? I mean, you were involved in editing that, weren't you?
Mm-mm.
No.
The Symphony Road, was it Symphony Road?
Sorry, yeah. It was
What year was it?
77.
Yeah, that's after me.
Yeah. Paul was not involved in that. And they didn't put the paper on the map. I think, the paper was on the map from the beginning because of the quality of the voices in it and the enormous generation gap in that time that it was, a voice of a set of people who really did not identify with the voices in the daily newspapers. And because of, stories that Paul solicited and edited about the declining Kevin White administration and stuff like that. I don't think that the arson.
Those were great stories, the declining Kevin White administration.
Yeah, so, it's, every mayor after a certain amount of time goes crazy in Boston.
But you got to remember, that was the period during which if you turn on the nightly news, it would be Walter Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite would have over his, I can't remember which shoulder, but the chyron over his shoulder, and it would be the flags. This is during the Vietnam War, and it would be the flags of the three combatants, the South Vietnamese Army, the United States, and the North Vietnamese, and there would be numbers. You may remember casualty numbers saying how many people died each week, and he would report this as if it were a fact. By the time, if you just tallied up all the North Vietnamese, there was nobody left in the country. They had, our numbers were so preposterous. And there was a big story, I remember, in the New York Times right around this period, this is 72 or something, saying how false these numbers were. And yet every night or week, whatever the time period was, the CBS would put this out there. That's the gap Mark's talking about. So we say, no, that can't possibly be. Of course, as Laura points out, we have Howard Zinn reporting on Vietnam. So it wasn't exactly even-handed. But we were the counterweight. And we had, with our audience, certainly more credibility. And we had a substantial amount of completely legitimate credibility because we were saying things that were disruptive and that the straight media wouldn't say or wouldn't cover or just, wouldn't accept. And so, anyway, just to amplify what Mark was saying.
I do remember the Kevin White administration came under a lot of heat. A lot of stories we did on it.
Yeah, no, that was after the collective. That
Right.
was in 75.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, we did invest it. Well, that was the other thing. You weren't constrained by cronyistic relationships with your sources because you didn't have it.
Right.
I mean, you had sources, but you didn't have any of the sources in the straight world, basically. So I remember I wrote a piece about Boston Celtics last week as a member of the Celtics. He went to the American Basketball Association. I wasn't a sports writer, so I hung out with the Celtics for a couple of weeks, and I could tell what I could report. This is after I was editor. What it was like, to be with the team. No normal sports writer could ever do that. I mean, you could even say it was a hit and run job on my part because I wasn't going back there. But you were allowed to use words like fuck or whatever in the paper, sort of HBO of its time, if you will. And so there was a veracity to it that wasn't out there in the other media. And then you didn't have the relationships with these people, so you didn't have to worry about your sources and cultivating them and keeping them. And so there was.
And you also weren't worried about your own stature in the community. I mean, yes, you wanted to be correct, but you didn't worry about, you didn't feel the pressure of, oh my God, now I want to really, now I want to jump to the New York Times and I want to do this and I want to do that. You were just, the real paper, I thought at that time, was it.
It was the counter culture.
It was exactly.
I was really cop kind, because he had worked, you know, for Time Life, and he had worked for the New York Review of Books, and he had covered, you know, Vietnam. And, you know, he was somebody I just, you know, looked up to as part of the establishment, but he was delighted to be working in the weeklies, first at Boston After Dark and then at the Real Paper as a columnist, because it was where he felt he belonged. And the great lesson, one of the many lessons that, you know, I took from that was that it really didn't matter where you were or what you were paid or what people thought. If you were doing the work that you were supposed to do, you should be happy about that. One of the ways that we abused our freedom was that we actually muckraked our own side. And I think this was very important, that we were willing to stay when somebody who was nominally on our side, part of the counterculture or part of the left or part of you know, our generation, was screwed up, we would go after them. And it's certainly one of the hallmark moments after the staff-owned paper was when a quasi-political bunch of bank robbers put a bomb in the Suffolk County courthouse. And they, you know, and they phoned us where their note was explaining their political reasons. And we had a considerable internal argument about this, but in fact decided that we were not in favor of terrorism, even in 1976, and that we would convey the information first to the FBI, rather than write an exclusive story, that this was our duty to society, and that we would avoid, you know, it becoming their political messenger because of this act that we didn't approve of. You know, we did run a story about prison conditions, which was what they were being bank robbers more than really political, but most interested in. And I think Paul may have written that story, and I don't recall exactly. But, you know, that was an important decision, I think, you know, that had to be taken among a number of people who thought, you know, hey, we've got this exclusive, let's run with it, or, you know, maybe we should be on their side. But, you know, almost everybody, including, you know, people who have very wild and crazy reputations, even now said, no, we're not going to do that. These people are not really part of us.
Harper, I'd like to ask you about relating the Real Paper to today. Does that sort of freedom, that sort of journalistic freedom, that sort of conscience exist today that you can see in any form in journalism?
Well.
Sorry for the expansive question, but I'm interested in that. Where do you go today? Salons?
I think, yeah, I mean, there's elements of it on the internet. There definitely are elements on the internet. I tell you though, this is probably a sign of getting old, but a lot of the stuff that I remember from the early Phoenix and the Real Paper, the only place I think you find anything like it these days is the New Yorker. And I guess that means I have gotten really middle of the road, I don't know. But there is this sort of, obviously anti-cop kind would not appear in the New Yorker, and I was being somewhat facetious. I mean, you can find anything you want on the internet. I don't know of any place where this sort of material is all gathered together, and part of the reason is that at that time there was a cohesive culture, as Paul says, the counterculture. There was something, there were baby boomers and people like Howard Zinn and Chomsky and so forth that were older but identified with the New Left, and there was a musical a tie-in musically that went through the whole culture, and it just was much more. There was much more of an identifiable counterculture there, so that a review of, so that I remember a picture Jeff Albertson took that this was actually for the Phoenix, not the Real Paper, but Jeff was the photographer, did a lot of photography for the Real Paper, and it was a picture from New York of a television studio, radio studio, of Chuck Berry and John Lennon doing the duck walk together, both with guitars, and I thought, That's it. I mean, that's kind of it in a way. And I don't think that a picture of Bruce Springsteen or Fitz and the Tremors or anybody now with some old rocker would does that make any sense? I'm struggling a little bit with this, but I think there was a real identifiable culture, and I think the culture is trifurcated, quadrificated, multiplicated now. So.
Oh, were you an editor or a writer?
yeah, okay.
I just want to say one thing. When I went to work for the Real Paper, we were located in a house at 10B Mount Auburn Street in Cambridge. It was the best office ever. It was a house that was gerrymandered into rooms, and we all sat in there. I see the room right now. I see Betsy Meyer sitting there, and at the reception desk. It was not a reception desk. I see me doing listings. I see Bert Solman, who was a writer for the paper, on the phone constantly. I see Ed Zuckerman on the phone constantly. I see a little dog named Teeter, who was a sheepdog, who was the smartest dog I've ever known in my life. And I didn't even like dogs then, but I loved this dog, Teeter, who would come in and out at will. He was nominally Bert Solomons. It was a wonderful office where you never knew who was going to walk up the stairs. And it was just close and warm and great. And that's one memory I have of the Real Paper, that I'll never, ever forget the office. I loved it.
Well, Teeter was probably like the rest of us. Where else was he going to work?
Yeah, really. He really had a job. And every day he had to go out into Cambridge and round up some people and bring them back.
No, I mean, but that's the point. We were part of this counterculture, and we didn't really have other places that were going to invite us in.
No, the big, as Harper was saying, the big difference then was there was really an us and a them, and it was just totally clear. The straight press was so straight, and they, journalism really has changed. In those days, there was a way to write every story, and the paper it was a little more sophisticated in the Times, maybe a little dumber in the Globe, but it was the same way to look at something and create the same package. And we just wouldn't have anything to do with that. It was really a writer's paper, and the editors were like the writers. And we could, one of my favorite pieces that we all worked on was a series of short profiles of members of the state legislature called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it was great. It was what you said. They weren't our sources. We had no ties to these people. They were just some of them real idiots who were, our elected officials, and others were good guys, and we talked, and we just put them out there like that. In those days, you never would have seen something like that somewhere else. Today, there are 190 places, and you haven't even left your computer where you'd see something. So it was great to be us. It was great to be doing it. And us was everybody. Us was everybody who read us. Us was, Back Bay to Somerville. It was us.
I'd like to invite the audience to ask questions now, if you have them. And please come up to the microphones and ask your question at the microphone.
By the way, there was a past participle that we used, which was to be globed. And I remember Joe Paletti, who had come from the Village Voice, edited the Phoenix Before You, and then went to work at the Globe. And I remember Arnie Reisman saying, the first time I heard it, "Oh, he's been globed." And that's what you're talking about.
And whatever happened to Joe Paletti.
Right. Straight jacketed.
Yes.
Can you, any or all of you, say something about what caused the ultimate demise of the Real Paper?
You're the business guy.
Good.
There are two stages to that. One is the first 5 or so years as a collective, and then I was not there after that, so I don't want to speak to this.
It seemed like 5 years. It was 2.5.
Okay, the first few years, it was a collective. We had set it up so that we owned equal amounts, and the rule was if you left the paper, you had to turn in your stock and we paid you the book value. And this all looked very neat and it was all legal and nicely written down. But over the years, as we actually succeeded, which was a shock to most of us, it became apparent that if the paper were sold, the shares would be worth more than they were on books. And it seemed to me that there's almost a necessary progression, because anyone who wants to leave is going to say, well, why should I leave? I'll wait and we'll vote to sell the paper and I'll get some money for my shares, not these paltry few $100s, but a few thousand. And eventually that, in a way that, I mean, there were other stresses and strains, God knows, but in some ways I think it was just the march of history. People got older and more experienced. Some people wanted to go to New York, take other jobs. They didn't, you know, you could only be a stockholder if you worked there. So that was how we agreed to sell it as a collective, to sell it to the group that David Rockefeller was part of. So, and after that, we weren't there, so I think the people who were there can talk about the later years.
There was an enormous strain. The other thing is that it's very, very hard to run an organization like this. I mean, to be part of it. I don't mean to, you know, be at top of it, the bottom of it, just to be part of it, where you all really have to get along. It's a very individualistic group of people, obviously, writers, and even the people who weren't writers were really writers, it turned out. And so it was just a very, very difficult thing to do. And all cooperatives run into this problem at some time or another. And we were really unprepared for that, I think. We didn't, I've always thought that one of the most important things was that we didn't hire people on the basis of how likely they were to get along with the group. And so we hired some people who were really, no, I don't want to say anything. They were not people who were on my side, so I don't want to say anything invidious about them.
The real paper should have been a co-op board, letting some
Well,
people in and some
we just didn't, maybe. We just didn't have real mechanisms for it. At any rate, those strains also tore at us, and I think contributed to tear us apart. But then, now why the paper ends is something else.
Yeah, on the off chance that the question was why did it really end at, under ownership in 1981, the answer was that we had been gradually outcompeted on the business side by the Phoenix, and certainly their editorial held up as well. As someone who read each paper intently each week, I could tell you 1,000 reasons I thought ours was better, but and as the editor at the end, I knew quite literally, but in general, they just got bigger, and then there was a recession, one of the periodic collapses in the home electronics business, which was one of our two largest advertisers, beer being the other. And if you remember, Quadraphonic didn't sell. Every so often the home electronics business would come up with the next new thing and it wouldn't sell. So it was one of these recessions in 1980, 81. And that just took enough air out of the possible advertising, and the paper was losing more money than the owners were willing to lose for the privilege of being denounced by their own staff.
I'd like to add that by then we had moved from that wonderful little place on Mount Auburn to a high-rise building on Mass Ave. 929 Mass Ave.
I think they turned our old office back into apartments to make more money.
Well, the Harper, if you want to tell what we were talking about at lunch with regard to the baby boom and
Well, God knows I don't remember what we did.
Okay.
No, I think that what was, one of the things that was happening was the baby boomers were getting older.
Your mic.
One of the things that was happening was the baby boomers were getting older, and the culture that I had talked about was beginning to fragment. But I think, Paul, you've pretty much convinced me at lunch today, I do remember, that probably one paper did succeed. I mean, there is still a weekly newspaper in Boston.
Succeeded splendidly,
We have the editor of the Boston Phoenix in the audience.
And the Boston Phoenix won. I mean, I think that they had better people on the business side, I think, but I'm not sure about that. I better ad salesman.
Well, there was a 15-year window with, you start with the Phoenix, the Cambridge Phoenix, will what you will, in 1981. That starts in the late 60s, and then in 81 the paper dies. And that's a period of time roughly equivalent to when the baby boom moved through. I mean, so there's at least something.
Yes.
Don't you think that geographically you were in the right place? In other words, there aren't many Cambridges around.
Although, interestingly enough, there are weekly papers in quite a few cities, but and you'd think Berkeley, California, if Cambridge was a good place, you'd think Berkeley, California would be a good place. And there's the San Francisco Bay Guardian is something else, but Berkeley never produced a decent paper. So I don't know. That was certainly, Cambridge was a great place to be.
Yes.
Paul Solman, I don't think that Cronkite was running a weekly death count that included the communists. There's no way to have gotten anything remotely resembling an accurate count on the North deaths. He did run an American death count on a weekly basis.
No, he had the North Vietnamese up there. My point is that of course it was inaccurate. It was made up. It came from, well, that's the way I remember it. So I guess we can.
I don't think so at all. I want to ask you this though: was there a sense of the paper that you guys were pulling for our enemies and against us, if not openly, then covertly? And an additional kind of a linking point, in '77, Sidney Blumenthal had a piece ripping Avi Nelson before he ran for the Senate. He was a radio talk show host at the time, and Sidney ripped into him for daring to go to South Korea and the connections between who paid for the trip. And the South Koreans are referred to as a dictatorship in the piece. He never laid a glove on the North Koreans, and they're much, much, much worse and more brutal dictatorship. So I want to ask you, how does that look in retrospect? Was Avi on the side of the bad guys back then or the good guys?
I think we could take a vote on Avi Nelson and come up with no votes. I mean, Avi Nelson's just not, I don't think he's in any of our ken. But I do think, I mean, there is a point with regard to, in 1972, we and the Phoenix joined together and did a joint cover. It was the same cover on both papers. It was called Peace on Earth, Victory of the Vietnamese, by which we meant the North Vietnamese. Now, in retrospect, it was certainly partisan. It was trying to be a counterweight. Would I say, in retrospect, knowing what I know now, that was legitimately partisan, that we weren't? No, I wouldn't say. I would say that we were sort of falling for what we believed in at the time.
Yes.
What we knew was that our government had lied to and misled us on the nature of the war in Vietnam. What we did not know until later was that the Vietnamese Communist Party also was misleading the people who fought on their side. And that doesn't undo what our government did in the 60s and 70s, in my view.
Basically, we were intervening in a war between two dictatorships, and that would not seem like a smart thing to do. That was my position at the time.
Yes, do you have a question?
Yes, I've heard various stories through the years about why the real paper was not able to continue as a collective. You mentioned the selling of the paper, I think it was in 1974, to David Rockefeller. And although the paper did continue for several more years, and some great stuff was in the real paper after 1975, the idea of it being a collective, I think, was a very romantic and a very positive thing, because here were a bunch of people who walked the walk, as it were, who believed in their ideals and were willing to put themselves in the line for it. And as so far as I know, and you guys are the experts, the paper from 72 to 74 did make money. It wasn't a money loser. It was a financial success. So with that as a backdrop, why, in your view, collectively, no pun intended, was it necessary to, if it was necessary, to sell the paper off to a private interest, who just happened to be a Rockefeller, and why it couldn't have gone on with the spirit of 72, as it were, beyond 1974?
Paul, you want to take that?
No, I've talked about it.
I think actually I was addressing that earlier when I said there was this natural pressure. Once we were a success, the shares that might have been worth $2,000 if you turn them back in, and Howard Garsh could actually explain this perfectly well, so I'll just, so I'll let him.
Howard, you want to talk?
How it works.
He
was the controller, so he can tell you.
And on the board of directors.
Right, and your point about the fact that we all realized that our shares could not possibly be worth, just on the book basis, as much as the goodwill that the company was actually building up. That was certainly a part, and there was quite a bit of discussion about that. But what I would want to mention, very directly in answer to you, is I remember the salary committee meeting at my apartment in Cambridge once, and we were trying to set the salaries for the next year. And the receptionist was there, and it wasn't Betsy, it was someone else. Betsy was in the editorial department. And she was one of the members of the staff who was there. And we were looking to trying to decide how much Bob Rotner, who was the publisher, should be getting. At the time, I believe he was getting $250. And we were looking to give him a salary increase up to something like $300 a week. And the receptionist was getting $175 a week at this time. And she couldn't understand, and no one could explain to her why it is that the publisher, with all those awesome responsibilities a publisher has, how could anybody be worth more than twice what she is worth, no matter what the work is that he does? And then when we got down to discussing the controller's salary, the fact that we were sitting on what looked to be a fairly new couch was literally mentioned by this young woman as proof positive of the fact that I sure as hell didn't need an increase. And then somebody alluded to the fact that there were a number of intramarital affairs going on at the time. And some of them were fairly high up in the organization. And it got to the point where literally staff were having to be on the side of the publisher or the associate publisher, the editor, or one person or another. And it got I don't want to be out of that. Yeah, not the editor, but various people. And it got to the point where stockholders meetings, of which I took the minutes, and I could probably sell them for quite a fortune. It got ridiculous. There was so much personal stuff going on that we realized that this was a wonderful cooperative idea. Each one of us had the same power. The publisher had his 100 shares, and the receptionist had her 100 shares, and it just didn't make any sense. And we thought this would be a good time to sell out. And the one last point I want to make is this: the beauty, the great joy that every one of us had was that Richard Missner sold the Phoenix to Stephen Mindich once when he sold us out, and I don't know how much exactly he paid for that. It took another 10 or 11 years before Rockefeller dropped out of it. Well dropped out. The governor was one of the owners. But it was 11 years later when Stephen Mindich had to pay all over again to put the real paper finally out of business. And that gave us all a great deal of joy.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. Yes, you have a question?
Monica, Steve Crosby. I was the
Steve
assistant
Crosby,
to the publisher
of
in 1976. My question, Monica, is just why do you think so many people sent their parents to this event?
No, Susan Garsh, Howard's wife, Judge Garsh, explained this to me when I said, well, okay, I see all these people from the real paper who were here, but who were all the other people? She said, they were all hawkers.
Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm Harvey Silverblade, and I wrote a column
Oh,
called
Harvey,
Brief
yes, you were
Cases.
real paper headliner.
Yeah, it was about judges and the fools they were, and court cases and unfair outcomes and police brutality and all of that stuff. And I have a general question of the panelists, and the question is, what impact do you think the writing in the real paper had on what's called the establishment, the real world? Did it have any impact, or was it just of interest to the counterculture community? The reason I ask the question is, I wrote the legal column. I still do, in fact. I'm the oldest living columnist still at the Boston Phoenix, maybe second oldest. And what I discovered when I was at the real paper was that my columns and the issues of the paper found their way into judges' lobbies all over the Commonwealth. And people would tell me, lawyers would tell me, court officers would tell me on the sly, because remember, I litigated cases, I was in the courts, that the judges were really concerned with what I said about them, what the paper said about them, and they would read it avidly to see if their name was mentioned in the legal column. I was astonished by this, but I found it very interesting and still do. So I'm interested in knowing what impact out in the establishment, in the real world, you think the paper had at the time.
I'll just throw in my 2 cents. I think the real paper was beautifully edited, incredibly well written. There was a great mix of stories about outlandish things, pedestrian things, unexpected things. I think it was a great read. No wonder it ended up in everyone read the real paper, I thought, and it had a great reach. But why don't you, Laura, and you, Mark, talk about the impact of the stories that were in the paper?
I think that I'm guessing that the real impact was more that I think journalism started to change in our years. It wasn't just the real paper, but the real paper and the Globe. It made a very vivid example. The Globe changed because of the real paper. And then when those of us who left the paper and went on out into places like Newsweek and the press and other major, bigger news organizations, we were still ourselves. We didn't stop writing for the real paper just because we weren't writing for the real paper. That certainly was my experience. And those things helped to change journalism. So that's what I would say is the big long-range impact. There was that we were part of something that really made a big difference in American journalism.
On the particular of judges, it's interesting because in the early days of the paper's day, judges, corrupt judges were often one of our issues. When I was on Boston After Dark, Judge Troy in Dorchester, who used to offer young people accused of crimes a choice of going to jail for 2 years or going down to the Army recruiter office and going to Vietnam, was one of our favorite subjects. He had engaged in land speculations and deals, and I remember being assigned to spend a day in the court of Judge Adlow of the Boston Municipal Court, who used to just basically yell at defendants and berate them and change their charges and bind them over on status offenses, which were later found to be illegal and removed. So we had a long history with judges and landlords, and there were certain prime targets at the time. And I'm sure they read the paper because they were tended to get in there.
All of those stories. Well, we had some success with, we got rid of the sheriff of Suffolk County.
Oh, right,
we got rid of, we had, certainly an impact, I think, negative impact on Kevin White's political career, for better or worse, but certainly, and there were numerous examples of targeted stories which did have some actual political impact, Harvey, and so I think, because other people weren't doing it.
Yes, you have a question.
First of all, I guess I'm a current staff writer at the Phoenix, so I'd just like to thank everybody who, I was only born in 1979, so for everybody who did,
Did we have anything to do with that?
I I've read through a lot of old real papers, a lot of old Phoenixes. I'm a big junkie for that kind of stuff, and I've heard a lot of the stories about just the competition. I heard one, it might have been in Jerry's movie, about the real paper sending someone to New York to review Manhattan to get it in before the Phoenix, or just something like that. So I was wondering if you could all comment about just kind of the competition and how that was really what kept the two papers going, and how you wouldn't have been able to do it without the other one, that kind of stuff. If that's true, and if there were any specific stories about, I don't know, spats or stuff like that.
Were you aware of the competition? I wasn't. I just thought we were sui generis. We were just ourselves.
Well, I had worked for Boston After Dark, so I was certainly aware of it. In fact, so Mark did, I did, Harper hired.
Well, were you aware of what they did week to week? Were you
Oh, sure.
aware of the two?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, look, it wasn't like there was this vast difference between the two. I mean, yeah, sorry, Laura. Well, if you call that a vast difference, then I suppose.
The time when I think we were all aware that there were two papers was when Mindich bought the paper, and we were struggling to become the real paper, and there was a drawn-out court case about the use of the name, and a little incident where somebody seems to have stolen some of the flats for the next issue were stolen, and of course they were returned very quickly. Anyway, there was a lot going on in court, and that was kind of wonderful, and the difference between the two of us, and they were like the big, Mindich. It was like this whole big. They were the establishment. They were the counterculture establishment, and we were the other ones. So that was like a little mini version of us versus them. So he made a wonderful enemy. It was great, and the Globe was always there to be the other. But to have Mindich be the other was a lot of fun. So that's when I think it became very lively, that moment.
Yes, you have a question?
No, I thought I'd probably answer some questions. I was the managing editor of the Phoenix from 1973 to 1980.
Oh, please identify yourself.
David Moran.
Hi, David.
And I never thought I would. I knew there would be shots about Mindich, but he needs no defending, and I would certainly not stand up to defend him. We were intensely aware and friendly with most of the people, with all of the people at the real paper. The only troubles we ever felt was seeing them either slump or fail or go through struggles. We could all count ad pages, we could all compute ad densities, we all had the same kinds of coverage. We just had an enormous amount more space. I don't know that it was because of ad salesmen, but we had huge audio supplements. I had a lot to do with that. We had a lot of audio writers who went on to New York to become famous audio writers. Like the real paper, we had film critics and political people like Paul. My first job after leaving the Phoenix in 1980 was to go work for the War Commission. The War Commission and the entire MBM thing was almost completely a Phoenix and Dick Gaines enterprise. Not different from the kind of stuff the real paper did, very similar. But it was, nobody at the Phoenix wished the real paper ill or any of the people there, and were very, I don't think we were that surprised when it finally folded, and I wasn't there anymore, but the slumping in the late 70s and as people left. The other reason we were worried is that when people left, it meant they would come to the Phoenix where we already had plenty of staff. We had more film critics and more audio people and more political people and more Kevin White bashers and more judge bashers and more Symphony Road arson investigators than we knew what to do with. So it was just to sit there and kind of watch the real paper struggle was for me very, very troubling. But whatever else you say about Mindich, we hired more, had more space, paid more. I made $500 a year more than Tom Freeman, which I can assure you was the last time that will ever happen. But that's just part of being, you can be pious and sort of holier than thou, that's fine. I'm not defending a businessman. 35 years later, I can tell you I've had so many worse bosses in the private sector than Stephen Minda. I mean, fools and knaves and sociopaths, and the Phoenix years and the real paper, friends of mine, years, it all looks fairly mature, and as Paul said, extremely sophisticated writing. Always too long, always windy, always wordy. I was the first, as Ken Emerson said, the first real copy editor, in addition to being managing editor at the Phoenix. And I was an English teacher before that. And I came there, and the other big difference was that kind of by accident, the Phoenix hired And it didn't, you know, the real paper was so good, this was not a major coup, but they hired a full-time Globe guy in 1973, who hired me. And he had been an ME, an assistant ME at the Globe. And for the next, well, I guess he left in '79, but for the next 6 years, he gave it, and his interest in the arts and in the feminism and the counterculture was, you know, 50-50, but his interest in hard politics was intense. So Bill Miller had a lot to do with the growth of the first section. And the rest of it, we were all kind of competing for the same dollars. We had the SAC Theater account. That probably alone right
SAC
there.
Theaters, I remember that.
Yeah, I mean, somebody was saying about, Mark was saying, you know, better ad sales, but maybe
I
let's
want to
make
get another
note.
question in, but
Anyway.
thank you so much.
So the success was self-evident and, you know, nothing to gloat about.
Thank you. Yes.
Let me make a comment. I took over women's notes from Laura, and some of you probably don't remember me because my hair is a different color.
Could you identify yourself?
My hair was dark. My hair is white now. My name is Ellen Cantaro.
Oh, Ellen Cantaro, how are you?
Ellen Cantaro, I'm okay. I'm getting a little older. But I came to the real paper in the latter, in its later life. And I would like to say just a couple of things about how the spirit that you guys have described of the original version carried over to the time when I was there. First of all, many people's careers, Laura's, yours, Mark's, yours, Jan, yours, Monica, were launched by the real paper. And mine in a kind of mini fashion. I mean, I didn't go on to the mainstream media, but I went on to write in the counterculture. I went on to write for The Voice, Mother Jones. I still write in the counterculture. I write online for Tom Dispatch and for other publications there. And I was trained how to write journalistically when I was at the real paper. I came from academia, unlike some of you, and I had an editor named Russ Hoyle, whose name has not been mentioned. And there were many feelings about Russ, but I remember Russ told me, "You think you can write, you can't." And I was really pissed at him, but I really learned how to write. The other thing has to do with editorial freedom. And now I'm going to introduce a more serious note. It didn't have to do with using words like fuck or cunt. Marty Linsky, who was a Zionist and who was not in the audience, sent me to Israel to write about nothing less than women in Israel. So that was a big topic. And I took on assignments for several other venues. One was an article about the settler movement in the West Bank for the Village Voice, and the other was an article about a village that was besieged by settlers for another venue. And Marty hoped that I would become converted to his point of view. And I came back and I was writing stuff that is not popular either in the mainstream press and that was not popular in the counterculture either. And he allowed every word to remain.
Thank you.
So
I'm going to get a couple more questions in before we're hitting the time wall here.
Okay.
But thank you for that, Ellen.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. You've talked a lot about us and them, counterculture press and mainstream press, and many of you have gone on to successful careers in the mainstream / straight press, and there's even a tie on the panel, which kind of offsets the mask. Could you talk about what that transition was like personally and professionally?
Who wants to tackle that? You went straight past it.
Well,
very quickly.
I started out with in the straight thread. I started out with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from '65 to '70, but I was the rock critic, and that's not. I don't know that my experiences were. Well, I remember chafing at some of the restrictions on the writing, and so when the offer came to come edit the Phoenix, I was really I was glad. And the freedom I had at the Phoenix and at the real paper, after I'd gone back to the daily newspaper, the Post-Dispatch, the freedom, it took me a while to get over it. But I think what I ultimately ended up doing, and I think what Laura did, and I think other people who went to more establishment media did, was bringing some of the spirit of the alternative press to the. I mean, I look at the papers like the daily papers like the Boston Globe and the New York Times, and New York Times particularly is written. It's almost as well written as the real paper was, you know? And I think that's because people are coming. I think the influence of the alternative press, the real paper, the Phoenix, the Village Voice. In particular, as always happens, I think, a generation grows up and becomes more, you know, but it takes over the establishment. So I think probably well, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. You know what I would like to do right now? I would like, starting over here, I would like everyone who wrote for the real paper to stand up. And I'd like us to go around the room because we're running out of time.
Worked at, because we've got people who work writers.
Oh, worked at, I love that. Yes, thank you. I'm being a little writer-centric here. I would love everyone who was associated in whatever way with the real paper to stand up, and let's start over here, and let's shout out your names.
Wendell Smith.
Oh my God.
Ed Siegel.
I've already spoken.
No, go on, say your name.
Allison Jarrow.
Russell Perkins.
Ben McClellan. Two stories.
Lucy Bartholomew. Renee Law.
Larry Campbell. Dave Rose. Fred Aptis. Gerald Perry.
Harvey Silverblade.
Betsy Meyer. Harry Byrne.
Yes. Over here, real paper people. Thank you all very much.
Monica, do we have time for the last two questions, or should we wrap up?
Well, I wanted to keep it on time, but our style David here, Jan Freeman, is saying let's extend it. Ask your questions.
Thank you all for letting me ask a question. I regret that I was not around when the paper was in existence. I was a child of the 80s, so unfortunately I missed the good writing of journalism. So my question is about...
I'm unfortunate. Think how old you'd be now.
So my question is about writing and journalism, because although I'm not a journalist myself, I did go to communication school, and I'm wondering about the real paper's journalistic philosophy. To what extent was objectivity important? Was it, and to what extent is objectivity in journalism necessary, helpful even? And I don't need to make this question too long, but what's the difference between good journalistic writing and good advocacy writing? And what was the real paper actually doing?
I think I think the personalities of the writers came through in the paper, in the stories of the real paper. So in that sense, the articles were not always advocacy journalism. I think what you should do with advocacy journalism when you do it is try to be fair. But the idea of on the one hand, on the other hand, back and forth is not necessary. I also think that if you're going to have an alternative press, you need a mainstream press to play off of. And I think we were lucky in that there was, this was the Vietnam era, the era of Watergate, the era of the Pentagon Papers and so forth. I think there were some good, damn good daily papers going on too, but we explained what they couldn't, I guess.
I personally, to this day, strive for rigorous objectivity, so I definitely take that very seriously. But on the rare occasions when I slip over the line, I remember that I learned it at the real paper.
I, on the contrary, think that our project was a great deal about destroying objectivity, about destroying the line between the audience and the reader, undermining professional qualifications of all kinds, making it possible for the people who were not writers for their voices to appear, and that with help from technology we have succeeded in this so thoroughly that none of us have jobs anymore. We have so undermined the value of professional credentials in every field of media. Fine musicians no longer have major label contracts. There are no major labels. Everybody has a CD now, though. And that was what we would have liked that. Anybody can publish anything. You could go on the internet and read anybody's opinion at any length. They don't have to be vetted by an editor in a letters to the editor column. They can write any darn thing. And so, we were completely successful in what we tried to do, and now must live with the consequences.
Al Gore didn't invent the internet, we did.
Yay! I love that.
Take your point.
This is not so much of a question, but just an anecdote that probably relates to Harper Barnes tried to fire me. He said, Wendell, he said, let's go up to Jack's and have a beer. And we sat down at Jack's, and Harper said, Wendell, I've been told to fire you.
Explain what you did, Wendell. I mean, just not what you did to occasion the firing.
Well, I would do things like stand up in the presence of the Vice President of the United States on national television, and this eroded the paper's credibility with the business community.
But explain what you did for the paper. I mean,
I wrote a column that was called Graffiti, and I was hitchhiked around the country and ended up in Wounded Knee in 1973. Went back in Wounded Knee and was arrested by the federal marshals there that April. Got shot at by some Kluxers in Georgia on a piece for Harper, and I would run a list of political meetings, and I had the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and the Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party all in the same, as if there was no difference between them, and I'm not sure that there is to this day.
That wasn't the problem, Wendell. It's that the column was full of your poetry.
Well, sometimes in April I cross the bridge between. Sometimes in April I cross the bridge between Cambridge and the Back Bay, and a faint odor catches up with me, and I can see, with my being who remembers the Ice Age, 2 millions of wild water fowl come to rest and feed and fertilize on their migrations. And I ask the white man in me, what happens when the salt grass disappears, when the marshes we thought endless isn't, when the eastern flyway is scraped out of the sky by the tombstones of these cities? How then will my children inherit the souls of Canada geese? And where will I find the wings of a trumpeter swan to carry mine? Now, I used to think that that made... When I was working for the real paper, I thought that meant my name was Trumpeter Swan. I now think that my name is something more like Wachichuka Sahawe, which is to say, the white man who is too arrogant to walk. So Harper tried to fire me, and I'm going to...
I think you got to speed this up.
I remember the name of the owner, Richard. So, and I said, oh, okay, Harper. And I marched back to the office, and I went into Richard's office, and I said, Richard, you can't fire me. And Richard said, well, if I can't fire you, I'll fire everybody. And that was what set off the strike.
Whoa, really?
Because I told him he couldn't run the paper that he wanted to. He couldn't fire me. I wasn't going to be tear gassed in Harvard Square while he was sitting in his office and taking the risks that were necessary to find out what was going on and be told by him that I couldn't do it anymore.
And now you catch the spirit of the times.
And Paul, what I want to say is, I never thought I'd hear you say that. and your firing me was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. And like any divorce, it took me a long time before I realized it.
That's very sweet of you to say.
Thank you very much.
You know, you all talk about, oh, I'm getting older. I'm exhausted.
You're not.
In 103 years, the Ford Hall Forum has never seen such a group of exuberant, brilliant, baby booming hippies.
No, we're a very rich. It's a very rich group here tonight. This has been an amazing experience for me. And I want to thank you all for coming. And let me just tell you that the first star interview I ever did for the real paper was Martin Mull. I went to Paul's Mall where I saw his performance and I wrote an interview with him. And at that performance, Martin Mull looked out into the audience and he said, I want to thank you all for coming, or however you reacted. And I remember about him, and that's what I could always write in the real paper. Thank everyone for coming, or however you react.